Without further ado, I would like to introduce you all speaker. I'm a front-end developer, Ms. Leesa Ward. Please give it up for her.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for having me here today. So I'm here to talk to you about CSS, specifically in React, and to give you an idea of where this is going and that sort of thing. Some things this was almost called. The first idea I had for a talk on CSS in React was an intro to style components, but I thought, oh, do I actually want to stand up here and sell you style components? There's probably a bit more to it than that I could be addressing. Might be what I end up doing anyway. We'll see how that goes. Or a journey to CSS and JS, how I learned to embrace the chaos, because to me inline styling was always a bit of chaos, and we'll see a bit of that. So to give you a bit of an idea of where sort of a bit of background where I'm coming at this from, because there might be some bits where I'm like, oh, I've never come across that before, or why didn't you mention this? A bit of context. So I worked in agencies for many years, sort of just building a lot of websites upon websites for lots of different clients, and also do that as a freelancer as well. Now for about the last 2 years, I've been in an enterprise environment working on internal products that are used within my company. And on the side, I do a bit of teaching as well. Most of my students are beginners, so that's sort of where I'm coming at this from. So as I mentioned, I worked in agencies a lot, mostly in WordPress, building custom themes and things like that. And then so I went to learn React about 2 years ago, expected to just be able to chuck some CSS in there. No, that's not generally how it goes. And similarly, there's all these different options. This isn't even complete, probably not even that accurate for what I put in there. I reached a point where I had to stop editing this. And so, but it was very much a case of, in a lot of ways, I'm like, for a lot of things, there's a lot of valid approaches to things, but you should probably pick one. I sort of tell my students in particular, I'm like, I don't mind if you want to, write class names using sort of a BEM style, or if you want to have a lot of different class names and inherit stuff or whatever. Just I want to choose an approach and stick to it for consistency. And then in agency work as well, we would sort of inherit a lot of websites that other developers had built. So while we had a certain approach for the things we built, if a client came to us with a pre-existing site, I'm like, we should continue to do what the previous developers did, otherwise we're just going to create a mess. Just because we like to do this doesn't mean that we should bring it in necessarily. So before you start thinking about all the tools I'm going to talk about today, I want you to think about what high-level approach do you prefer? Some of it you might end up throwing out, depending on what tool you end up using. We'll see why later in this presentation. But sort of having that general sense of this is how we like to approach things. Like, for example, do you prefer to avoid anything presentational in your HTML or in your JSX? I mostly like that, where like, it should be pure semantic HTML, but that is a lot easier said than done, and particularly since I started working with React, I've found there's times where it makes sense to have a little bit in there, so it's a lot easier said than done. Do you like your CSS to really embrace the cascade and inherit stuff? Do you want to have, this is what my paragraphs look like, except here? And that might even vary depending on the design sort of thing. Is there a sort of approach that you have for class naming? Or do you just go, you know what, nah, just put classes on everything presentational. I'm going to have classes that say, color gray and stuff like that. Just, I'm going to have 20 different classes in my HTML, and that's how I like to throw things at it. So there's not really a quiz that you could, that there's not like a Cosmo quiz that's going to tell you that if you choose mostly A, that you should use CSS modules. If you choose mostly B, that you should choose style components or something like that. And there is going to be a bit of crossover. So sort of end up contradicting myself a little bit. I'm like, pick one, but also there might be times where you don't. Where it makes a bit more sense to sort of pick a few pieces from each thing. But since we only have about 20 minutes, obviously can't talk about every single option under the sun. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey through a few different options that I have been working with. Starting with, so I mentioned earlier, I just thought I could throw some CSS at that. We're going to look at that first and then look at why that's not usually the best approach, and then build up from there. So I'm calling it vanilla CSS or SCSS with Sass, calling that even vanilla because it's ultimately going to compile into just CSS. It might look something like this, to build something like this. And so why might we want to do that? What are the pros of that? It is the easiest transition or ramp up if you're transitioning to React. So if I've got anyone here today who has been working on WordPress themes or something like that, or anything that's not sort of React, and you've been building a lot of HTML and CSS, that's the easiest way that you're going to get started. It's no extra dependencies. That's usually a good thing. It's very portable, could even be framework agnostic. So like I could theoretically build the same component in one of my WordPress themes in PHP and HTML and so on, and build the same one in React and apply the same style sheet to it if I wanted to for some reason, because it's just all the same class names. And debugging, the class names are exactly what you said they are when you go in the browser, which sounds kind of obvious, but we'll see why later, why that might not be the case anymore. And yeah. But there are some cons, obviously. Things are not scoped to the component. I'm going to be talking about that quite a lot because, sort of with React and other frameworks like Vue and so on, we're componentizing everything. We're not sort of cascading over the whole page because we don't know what's going to be on the whole page, and that's kind of the point. So it's not properly scoped unless you have, done that in your CSS yourself, but then someone could come along and grab that class and apply it to something else. It's all global ultimately. And that can cause conflicts and specificity issues because it is cascading style sheets. And that reliance on classes may not necessarily be a good thing because you can create tech debt where you've got classes that aren't being used anymore. If you've used class names like color gray and now you want it to be blue, you've now got to go and change your class name, and all of that's very annoying. Which can cause, those portability issues. When I worked in agency work, I had a whole lot of conversations with colleagues where I'm like, no, even the Sass variables, I'm like, no, don't call it blue and pink. Think, what functionally is blue the main color of the theme? Call it primary. Call this one secondary. So then I can pick up this component, put it into another client's site, and it will recompile the Sass. And so color primary means something different, but it's just going to apply that straight away. Are you creating issues by doing it that way? And that's where our CSS modules come in React, is it solves a lot of those problems I just mentioned because everything is scoped to the component. Make sure I've actually said all of that. And so it looks something like this. The styles actually come in as an object, so it has that .module.css or .scss if you're using Sass naming convention. They come as an object, and you throw that class name on there. And so it does mangle it a little bit when it builds. So for that debugging part I mentioned earlier, but it will still have the name in that little mangle bit so that you don't have conflict. So I could have two things called album card, and they're not actually going to conflict. So it's going to look something like that. You can also have it inherit to a point. So you'll see in that bottom right, I've got that album meta composers caption. Caption is a class that I've defined in another file, and then it's going to grab all those styles and add to it as well. Very similar to extend in Sass. And so we then build the same thing, essentially. So the pros of doing that, it is a very shallow learning curve. If you know CSS, you can pick up CSS modules pretty quickly. And it's scoped to the component, but you can also extend and share styles using that composition option, and you're not introducing any dependencies. But the downside, there are some tricky differences if you're coming from, especially if you use Sass. We only have 15 minutes left, so I can't go into much detail about that, but it does happen. Everything is scoped, but it can still have conflicts for a couple of reasons. Like you can actually make something global from right there in the file and go, hey, don't scope that bit. And if someone else has done that, or you 6 months ago did that and forgot, you could have something unexpected. I also had one where I'd brought in something from another library, needed to style it by its class name, and I nested it inside that because I was using Sass, being like, yep, in this context it's this, but it was still conflicting with the original style because I wasn't in control of the loading order of that. So there are a few little things like that to get used to. But then to come to our next level, of style components, which you might have heard of, which is that CSS and JS chaos that I mentioned before. That's what we use mostly at my day job. So when I was decided what to give this talk on, I asked some friends and colleagues in other companies what they like, what they work with, and so on, just to get a bit more of a lay of the land. And one of them said, styled components give me the ick. Okay? She went on to explain, I just don't find it very easy to read and maintain. I'm like, you know what, that's fair. Because when I first opened a style component, you know, my first company working with React, I'm like, cool, where's the CSS? Open up a style component and went, what is this? You write your CSS like this. You're like injecting, like what is going on? You're like injecting it. Why? Why are we doing all of this? And they can also get very complex because you can pass props in, because ultimately they are a React component. And so you can do all kinds of JavaScript magic with them, which is a strength. But this is a fairly contrived example, but it is based on things I've actually seen. The code on the left there, which you can get from my GitHub that we'll see later if you want to have a play with this, where you passed in, you know, whether it's open and a keyword about its position, then we're going to do a whole lot of conditionals to decide which property to use and what value to give it. And yeah, I saw something like this, and it took me a hot minute to work out exactly what that was doing. And on the right is like ultimately what that's building. It is a truncated example, and how we might do it, you know, with a module and with Sass. But so, you know, to keep everything nice and in that one component, the code can actually get quite complex. Cool. But once you get over that, over that learning curve, there are a lot of powerful reasons you might want to use style components. Themes are one of them. So it's got this theme provider component where you can pass it an object of various properties that you want to use, and then you could then use that component somewhere else within another theme, like so light and dark mode is an obvious example, but you know, if you're building different things within your company and you know in this sub-brand it's blue and in this sub-brand it's green, you just wrap it in the theme provider and go, yeah, you use this theme, you use that theme. You could also have things like, I mentioned light and dark mode. You could have things like a high contrast theme. People could choose their own theme and could be really good for accessibility. Just chuck in that theme provider and it will just apply that theme to it. Very handy. You don't need to add any classes to be able to do it. You just put it in, you know, I'm going to use primary color here sort of thing. What you can also do is, I mentioned briefly earlier, you can pass props. The example I'm going to use, somewhat niche but very cool, is passing in color props for dynamic theming. And then I'm using a library called Polish with some color functions, but you could write those as well, because this is JavaScript at this point. You can do things like conditionals. And so I could do things like this readable color function is going to choose whether that's readable and things like that. And so we can build things like this. We do not need to know, and this as well. So we do not need to know that when we're building our site or our app, what color every album we're putting on this page is going to be. We don't need to know what the albums are. That might be coming from somewhere else. And you know, that maybe the user or someone is then choosing from a color picker, and we can grab that hex code that they've chosen in that color picker and pass that to our style component and do stuff with it. And that's how we can get things like this. We don't need a whole library of what colors can be assigned to albums. We can do things like this and this. We can also do, which is where these color functions come in extra handy, so this function is also from Polished, which is meets contrast guidelines. It gives us scores against you know, level A, AA, and AAA accessibility. And if it does not meet those, we could do something like darken it. Or if it was a dark theme, lighten it. So we can go, okay, this pink, the title is that's too pale on the white, and that's going to tell me the contrast ratio of that. And so I can then do something in my code to darken it, in this case the shade function from Polished. And so I could, you know, I should really be checking that again, but this is a simple example, to find an accessible shade. And so we can do that, you know, dynamically rather than, making all of these darker than what's been entered, which might not be the end result that we wanted, because, one's like jagged little pill there in navy blue. We don't want to darken that any further. It's going to go black. Just dynamically, the ones that need to have their colors adjusted can. All right, so to summarize that, why you might want to use style components is it is scoped as well. So like CSS modules, it's scoped, but you can also have nested overrides, which could also be a con, depending how it's applied. Passing props to do dynamic things like color adjustments, so, and also things like open and closed state and stuff like that. It's only generating the CSS that is needed at that moment in time, rather than, oh, this is the default and this is when it's open, and things like that. You can use TypeScript, if we have any TypeScript fans. So then you can require certain props to be passed through. So like if you're then trying to do something with a color or an open status, you can make it so that that has to be used, which is pretty important. With one of the really useful use cases of style components in my experience is for design systems and component libraries, which brings me to my next point, portability and extensibility. Like I mentioned earlier, I like to be able to go, yep, I need that one again for this project. And so, yeah, like we have a component library where I work, and so, everyone can access that, and like so everyone's using the same button. We've decided what a button is, and a widget thing or whatever it might be. And so the consumers of those components then must put in certain props for it to do whatever styling that has. The cons, steeper learning curve, like I mentioned, my friend is like, oh, that's just confusing to read. And when I looked at it, I'm like, what is this? I have no intention of bringing style components into my classroom because we're already throwing so much stuff at beginners. I want them to learn HTML before we abstract it away. And yeah, they're already learning, multiple different languages. We do not want to add that extra layer of complexity. Readability, and we'll see a bit more of that in a moment. Likewise, abstraction and tight coupling. So it's ultimately a component. It's all built in together. That can be a strength. That it's like you can now go off and use that in your app. But is that something that's going to be useful for your use case, or is it actually going to get in your way? So regarding readability, can you tell from this which of these is a style component, which is a regular function component? Probably not. Having said that, you'll often see naming conventions like prefixing it with the word style to make that little bit more readable. It abstracts away the HTML. So you actually define in your style component, which you have to think of a name for, everything, end up sort of being, feels like you're doubling up. Sometimes they go, yeah, it's a header. There's already a tag for that in HTML or something like that. But it's actually abstracting away what HTML it is, especially if it's in some sort of library that the person using it is not actually going to edit. That can be a good thing because things like, especially like something clickable should probably be a button or a link depending on what it does. Don't make clickable divs, don't put click events on SVGs styled like buttons. And so it's like, yep, this is a button, and we've already defined what it is according to what our accessibility expert has said this should be this. But that can very much be a downside as well. It's abstracted away so you're not thinking about what it is, and you might use something that's not quite right. If you've got like my students or juniors and interns and things and not thinking about HTML, they're only thinking about the component, and that can have some implications. And I'll also call out in this one what I didn't put in this screenshot, but I mentioned debugging earlier. You'll notice the class names are all just random, or seemingly random, so you can't really use those to target, nested styling. You can't use them for testing, like to find a component in your test, but there are ways to get around that, like we usually add a data attribute, like data component ID or something like that, so that we can find them. And so when we're debugging our styling there, I go, well, what is SCKW? How do I know what component that is? Usually add something in there so we can actually find it. Now I mentioned that wraps everything up into a nice tightly coupled little package. We're not really got separation of concerns anymore. because I thought I'm all about separation of concerns. And then I realized I like style components, and that's not really separation of concerns. But because everything's tied up in a neat little package, but you can still extend it. So like how you might have in plain CSS, you're like, I'm going to use this class name, but then in this context override it. You can go, yeah, well, this is a button, but semantically I need it to be a link, even though the designers made it a button. So I can create this one called button link and go, hey, you're a button, except in terms of the component name, except I'm going to make you a link. I'm going to make you an A tag, and I'm also going to add a couple more styles. Or like I had an example where I had like a little widget with a border, and in that particular context, I needed to add a bit more styling because it was Flexbox, and I needed to extend the height, and that wasn't built into what was done in the library. And go, okay, you're a widget, but you're 100% high, and then away we go, basically. And then so yeah, we end up building the same thing. So all those little, I've added buttons now, except those semantically are links, but they are styled exactly the same as buttons in this application. And so it would be remiss, I do only have a couple of minutes, I'm going to have to speed through it really quickly, would be remiss of me not to mention the multitude of pre-existing libraries and frameworks we have for UI. I'm going to use Bootstrap in my example just because that's what I have the most experience with, and most of us know it, but the principles will apply whether you might be using Material UI, Semantic UI, whatever you might be using. But there's a library called React Bootstrap, which is style components, so we can do that extending thing. And so like this is me writing it all from scratch. And then if I use React Bootstrap, I can get rid of that. So I can go, yep, all of that stuff for a container is already there. Likewise for a column. The one on the right there, you can just put those properties also straight into your JSX. You don't have to put it in where you've defined the style component. This is just how I like to do it. And it's one of those cases where it's pick one, either are valid, but pick which way you're going to add those attributes, whether in your JSX or in your style component, so it's nice and consistent for everyone. But there's so much less styling needed now because it's already there from that library. So that enables rapid development. Our libraries are usually already pretty battle tested, and you have less need for CSS expertise. So we have a lot of more people sort of entering the industry as full stack by default, people who are traditionally front end doing more across the stack. You're just spending a lot less time working with and learning CSS. And so this sort of makes life a bit easier for you. Having said that, they can be a bit too opinionated and too prescriptive, which can impact portability, like Bootstrap, for example. I used Zurb Foundation in my work for a long time. Bootstrap made sense sort of when we needed to bring people in. But like, hey, I have container, row, and column, and that might not be applicable if you want to use something else sort of thing. And then when you do need to use more complex CSS, you still need someone good at CSS. So super quick summary, because we're running out of time. What is your preferred high-level approach? How does this fit in? You might need to make some changes to your approach. Which feature you're actually going to use? Are you going to create tech debt, like class names that you don't need anymore? Portability and extensibility, do you need them, and how? Is that internally? Are you publishing this for other people? Onboarding is the main one I wanted to touch on here is, do you have a lot of juniors and interns you need to ramp up quickly? Do you have contractors who you need to ramp up quickly? Or on the other end of the scale, are there certain patterns in your hiring where everyone in your area sort of knows and likes this one, so it sort of makes sense to keep using that thing? All right, got a minute and a half. That one of my friends who I did a try run with this, where she's like, oh, when I see this sort of presentation, I really like to close. I want to hear what your favorite is. And I think that would be a good way for you to close. I'm like, don't make me pick one, because I can be convinced of pretty much any of these and others, including Tailwind maybe, if I see and experience a good use case for it. Like I thought the BEM naming conventions were stupid when I first started. I'm like, why would you have these long, convoluted class names? And then I got into an agency where it made sense because we really needed to compartmentalize those things. We didn't have a default style for a paragraph that it made sense to have this default and then override it. I'm like, oh, okay, that's why we do it. It's actually really easy to write, and SAS is really neat. That's actually cool. So I do like style components, as you can probably tell. I'm finding myself reaching for that in my personal projects, even when I've started with something else, like, oh, I want to do that. But also, like I mentioned, very contextual. I'm not going to bring that into my classroom. And you know, it is introducing another dependency, and so if you don't need those benefits, then it would not be your favorite choice. So short answer style components, long answer, it's very contextual. So just on time, thank you very much, go forth and style. I have put up today's examples and experiments, far from the most perfect HTML and CSS in the world, but hopefully get something out of it, up on my GitHub. So if you do want to have a play with those, you are most welcome to do so. Thank you very much.